Not Quite Right features discussions that are unfiltered and uncensored and may include themes that are inappropriate for younger listeners. Also, I swear a lot.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the first of 5 Daredevil episodes for the October round of the Not Quite Right prize. And Daredevils are people who have volunteered for the privilege of having their stories read out on the podcast and being roasted by us. And as always, we will try to be constructive for the benefit of the author, but also for the benefit of everyone listening.
And look, I will say that we've both had some wine. And
Yeah.
if that's your thing, maybe it's time to have some wine yourself. Just numb the pain a little bit. Basically, we want to help you improve. We want to help other people improve. Like, we're all constantly learning. None of us are perfect at this craft of writing. None of us. So there's always room to learn and grow. And that's really the spirit we come to this with.
Yeah, and these are our own opinions, so they're not definitive by any measure, but
No.
it is a competition and we are the judges. So if you want to get some insight into how we reach our decisions, this is the episode for you.
Absolutely.
And just a reminder, so this is the October 2024 round. We had 3 prompts. The word prompt was palm, the action prompt was telling a lie, and the anti-prompt was avoid head hopping.
Yeah, so the anti-prompt is basically break the rule, avoid head hopping. And we had some very creative takes amongst the Daredevils on how that was handled.
So the first lamb to the slaughter is Nina Miller, and her story is called The 3 Lies and 1 Lifetime of Rucha Shah.
Yeah, Nina's a friend of the podcast online, and Nina has done critique with us before. So I guess she just wanted to dial up the pain a little bit for some reason. So we're going to read Nina's story now, and then we'll hear from Nina as well afterwards. And we'll have a bit of a chat about our thoughts and feelings about the story, some things that we liked about it, and maybe some areas that we think might be areas for improvement as well.
Yep.
So here is The 3 Lies and 1 Lifetime of Rucha Shah by Nina Miller. When Rucha attended her own wake, she never imagined her entire family would be in attendance. Yet there they were, thinking how much love they had for her as they surrounded her coffin. Obviously, it was an open casket, as Rucha was drop-dead gorgeous at 40. "You're lying," said one head of Cerberus, startling Rucha from her tale. She stood on the shores of the river Styx once more. The 3-headed beast loomed 6 feet above her. Behind them, the portal to Elysium beckoned. "Try again," said another head. "Your life through the eyes of another is the key." Rucha, devastatingly gorgeous in casket couture, had an outpouring of love for her life in service to others. People scattered flowers on her and thought of all the children she saved, rescue animals she... "Lie," said the 3rd head. "I'll have you know I was pretty important on Earth. Your job is to let me through, not sit there judging me," said Rucha, wearing the same Prada dress she'd been cremated in. Cerberus huffed. Rucha smelled fire and brimstone emanating from each ugly maw. "Fine," said Rucha, crossing her arms. "It's cruel to see her suffer," the doctors thought, as Rucha lay bedridden from cancer. "Lies," said the 1st head. "Leave us, lost soul." "Listen, you jumped-up bitzer. Shouldn't you be guarding Hades?" Rucha asked with the voice she reserved for Mater D's when she didn't have reservations. All 3 heads looked toward each other. No easy feat with their stubby necks. They grumbled in rapid succession, making Rucha's head spin. "Says we've gone soft. Just a bloke with a lie. Beautiful music, though. Drug cakes, too. Hades knows we like snacks. Should have been provided more snacks. It was sweet music. Sweeter cakes. Soft? We'll show 'em who's soft." Cerberus's 3 sets of ears drooped. Their tail went between their legs. Rucha moved forward, palms open to show she was harmless. They reminded her of Snookums, her childhood terrier. In truth, Rucha alienated everyone she'd ever known while climbing to the top. She died the way she lived, selfishly and unashamed. After one too many Jaeger bombs, she'd fallen off her yacht. Her behaviour meant she couldn't get reincarnated and was locked out of top-tier afterlives. Her last roadblock to paradise was this sad puppy. Okay, boys, I'll play nice, she said, stroking their matted fur. Rucha's wake was poorly attended. I spent my life bitter, angry, alone. I should have been grateful for my successes and shared them with friends and family. I saw love as a weakness. If I could do it again... Rucha sighed. Cerberus looked up, serpentine tail wagging. Truth. They bowed their heads to her. Hop on. Rucha sat atop the middle head, but rather than entering Elysium, Cerberus tossed her back across the river Styx towards Earth and into a waiting womb. She needed a second chance, said Cerberus, curling up for a much-needed kip. Think she'll do better this time? One can only hope.
So thank you, Nina, for your story. And actually, Nina left us a voicemail. So let's listen to what she had to say.
Hey, Ed and Amanda. It's Nina Miller from the USA. I'm happy to be part of this Daredevil episode. I was thinking originally about head hopping with the idea of a personality being told through the eyes of others. But at 500 words, it seemed pretty ambitious to be able to get in all the facets of a person. It would take too many characters. And then I thought about what if the character had more than one head and we had hopped within, and thus came Cerberus. From there, the story just started writing itself. I'm very much a pantser and a plotter, as you may see as the tale unfolds. And other than feeling a bit restricted because of the nature of being podcasted, I would say it was overall a very enjoyable experience, and I'm grateful to Not Quite Right for offering it. Good luck to everybody and the contest.
So just based on Nina's comments there, and also Nina's comments in the form when she entered her submission, I think she was a little bit nervous about her story being featured in audio on the podcast for everyone to hear, and I fully understand that. And she sort of indicated maybe she held back a little bit from what she might have otherwise done if she felt a little bit less observed, maybe, which is interesting because, of course, when you enter a competition, you're going to be observed by the judges. But we're putting it all out on the table today, and so hopefully this will be an enlightening experience.
It's hard to shut that part of your mind off, that kind of critic or the person who worries about what other people are going to think. But, you know, this is a bit of a safe space, I think.
I think so. Like, as much as, yeah, sure, heaps of people are going to be listening to this. At the same time, like, we all want you to succeed. We all share that desire to learn and grow and learn from each other. Hopefully that's something that we can provide now.
And as you'll hear in coming weeks, there's very little that is off limits.
Yeah.
when it comes to the Daredevils. So whatever you want to write, just do it.
Yeah, I would say that as a starting point. Like, we'll get into the story itself, but please don't censor yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like that's one of the skills that we have to learn as writers is to be able to put our souls out there, because that's what we're doing, right? And some of the most resonant stories are the ones where, like, your guts are just out on the table for someone to see. So I think that's usually creates the most beautiful art, when you see that someone's just cut themselves open and bled out, you know, what the story's going to be, and they're brutally honest with themselves and how they feel. I think that can be deeply resonant. So by all means, put it all out there, because I don't think you'll lose. I think actually you gain in artistic pursuits by putting it all on the table.
Yeah, that's what we all want to read, isn't it? Because we all have this stuff inside of us, and we want to see someone actually throw that out there and let us see it.
Because isn't that sometimes what the beauty of art is, right? Like seeing yourself and being like, oh, I'm not the only one, right? Like we share this human experience. This is a shared thing, and it's not a secret anymore. Like I keep this thing in myself and I don't tell anyone, and now I can see someone's put it out there. It's like, oh, I'm not so scared of that anymore.
But anyway, thank you for sharing your story with us, Nina. And I really like the premise that you have here of someone who is grappling with their life in the afterlife and trying to be honest, not just with Cerberus, but also with herself. It's that theme of being honest with yourself about who you are and coming to terms with that. And I think the setting that you've chosen is quite a ripe one to showcase that aspect of humanity. So let's get into the story and we'll go through it and talk about our feedback.
All right, so how did you feel about the opening of this story? Because we know openings are super important for sort of grabbing our attention as judges. We have, when Rucha attended her own wake, she never imagined her entire family would be in attendance. Yet there they were, thinking how much love they had for her.
This first line, obviously for me, what's important in the first line is that it sets the scene. It tells you where you are and who your perspective character is and lays the foundation for the tone and also, what's your story going to be about. I think this opening paragraph does that. And then when we go to the second paragraph and we are introduced to Cerberus, there is that surprise there of actually we are somewhere different to what we expect. So I think those two paragraphs together do set the scene.
Yeah, I agree. I think Nina's done a great job of setting up who the character is. She's done some character development there in the way of how Rucha is describing herself. We get a very strong sense pretty quickly that she's lying or that she's exaggerating her life's achievements and so on. And yeah, we have Cerberus put right up front there, which I think is really important because that's obviously quite a big thing. Like, you're reading a story, you're not expecting you're in Hades or whatever. Yeah. That needs to be set up pretty quickly. Otherwise, I think we'd be thrown for too much of a loop. So I do think Nina's done a good job of getting that up there. One thing I would challenge about it, and I'm talking about the second paragraph here where we introduce Cerberus and we describe Cerberus as startling Rucha from her tail. She stood on the shores of the river Styx once more. The three-headed beast loomed 6 feet above her. Now, that's super intimidating, but I didn't feel intimidated. Like, I didn't feel like this description of Cerberus was maybe sufficiently scary or intimidating or ominous. It was kind of just like, there he was looming 6 feet above her. I think maybe there was a missed opportunity to create a little bit of atmosphere there. And I'm not sure exactly how you would achieve that because you have described that he's looming above her and you've described that there's the portal to Elysium beyond, but maybe just a little bit more colouring in there. And I'm not sure exactly what emotion you'd be wanting to evoke, but just trying to get us in that space. So some sensory details to make us feel like we're there with like a 6-foot looming 3-headed dog, you know?
You're right. And I guess we don't really get what she's feeling in that moment up front, right? It takes a little while for us to really understand, well, who is she? Who is Rucha? What is she doing there? What does she want out of that situation? And we're not sure until we read a little bit further what she's feeling in that moment.
I think so. And I think thinking through what do you want the reader to take from this? And, I always bang on about Poe's single effect, like what effect or emotion are we trying to evoke here? And then using that setting, using the details that you describe to help support that emotion. Whereas in these initial couple of paragraphs, and look, a couple of paragraphs in a 500-word story is a lot of real estate, right? So those first couple of paragraphs are quite plain. They're stated quite factually. This is what Rucha is, how she's describing her life. Cerberus is like, that's a lie. Can we evoke some more of that mood, some more of this kind of self-reflection idea that we're trying to get at? And so, for example, if you're faced with Cerberus at the gates of hell, how is that making her feel? Is she feeling tension from that? Like, because she's bullshitting, right? At the gates of hell kind of thing. Like, is that creating any conflict or tension for her? Or is she just kind of like happily continuing on her bullshit?
Yeah, and I think we're a little bit unsure about who she is in this moment. We get a view that she's vain, right? She thinks very highly of herself. And she's also a bit of a Karen, right? Like she's trying to impose her will on the people around her. She doesn't come across as sympathetic necessarily, like as a reader, like am I on her side? And that doesn't necessarily mean that your main character always needs to be, quote unquote, the good guy. But I feel like as a reader, there needs to be some emotion for me to latch on where I feel like, well, I actually want her to achieve what she wants. And
like a vulnerability that you can tap into of this vain person. Well, why are they putting up a front? Like, what is it that's prompting them to behave that way? And
I feel, just to go a bit deeper into the story, I feel like you have that arc down. The story arc that you have here is that Rucha wants to enter the afterlife, right? And she presents a side of herself that is not true. It's kind of her projection of herself. And she has this interaction with Cerberus that forces her to acknowledge who she truly is. And I think that's a great arc. I'm not sure if I get to the point of when she acknowledges that's actually coming from her as like a realization. It still feels to me like she's just putting on a front. And she's just, oh, I need to do this. I need to say these words. So I think early on you need to set up that transformation that is going to come in Rucha's mind, that she acknowledges this fact about herself.
Yeah, so if we're going to go bigger picture, I completely agree with you. And I would say all the pieces are there of the puzzle for Rucha, but there are a couple of linkages missing that would elevate the story and make it a bit more resonant. So we've got this arc, as you've said, where Rucha comes in, still that same vain character. And then by the end, she's acknowledging her limitations as a human being, basically. But from a plot perspective, we don't have the mechanism there for why she makes that change, right? So we've got her in the beginning. She's talking herself up to Cerberus. We don't really know why. What's her motivation there? Is her motivation that she thinks, oh, if I talk myself up now, I'll get a better afterlife?
Yep.
Is that it? We can maybe assume that. So maybe that needs to be on the page, like understanding why is she trying to sell herself to Cerberus? Is she just carrying on with her bullshit, or is she doing it to achieve a specific aim? And I think she needs to be trying to achieve a specific aim, i.e. getting a better afterlife. And this fact of her being ruled out of contention for reincarnation, that comes late in the story.
Yeah.
I think that needs to come right up the front. We need to know right at the beginning, Rucha cannot reincarnate because of these reasons. Now she's trying to argue with Cerberus to get a better afterlife, the best possible one that she can get. Okay, now we get it. Good. Okay, we're on board. We understand why she's lying.
Yeah.
She has a motivation now. We can, as humans, relate to why she might lie to try and get what she wants. And I think then we're on board with the story. And then from there, like right now, the changes seems to be motivated by she's lying. Cerberus cuts off and has this kind of episode
Yes.
where it's arguing with itself or going through this like stream of consciousness of its own.
Yeah.
And then she's like witnessing that. And I don't know really what triggers that. It just sort of happens.
Yeah, so Cerberus responds to Rucha saying, listen, you jumped up bits, so shouldn't you be guarding Hades? And, Cerberus gets all defensive and has this existential crisis and which works against Rucha. Like they come to the conclusion that they're being too soft and they need to be a bit harder. So that's another level of plot that comes through there. But I feel like a focus on the character, on your main character there and what they want out of the situation would serve the story a little bit better than kind of digressing into the mind of this other character.
Yeah, exactly. So when Cerberus kind of has this little, I'm going to call it an episode, has a little episode in response to her response is that she thinks about her childhood puppy and then immediately the truth comes out.
Yeah.
Immediately she's like, oh, actually, I was a horrible person. Like, why? What's triggered that exactly? Is she a dog person? And is that why she's now relating to the dog maybe better than she was ever related to a human, and she's feeling a little bit of empathy because Cerberus has had this episode, and so she's trying to like now sort of say, oh, no, it's all right. I'll be honest now. Is that what's happening? And if so, why? And what does that mean for her? In stories, in terms of plot, you want each domino to be knocking over the next domino, right? And I'm not sure that the dominoes are really knocking each other over here. Like, why does Cerberus react so strongly when she calls it a bitzer? Like, this is the guarding the gates to hell kind of. This dog must be kind of tough, wouldn't you think?
Yeah.
But it's just overreacted, I would say, very quickly to what she said. And then she, in response, overreacts massively by being like, oh, okay, now I'm going to not do all of the things I've always done my whole life and I'm going to be honest for the first time. And I'm just not sure I understand the motivations of either of those characters for making those huge changes to who they are. I think what Nina's done really well here is give us that change because we need that in a story. Like otherwise what's happening? It's just a sequence of events. Well, what's happening here is that Rucha is finally acknowledging the ways in which she's been inadequate in life. So that's great. That's a great character arc. But what we need to understand is what caused that. Why did that happen? And then if we understand why that happened, I think that would feel more satisfying in the end rather than just like, oh, it's happened now. Like, well, why?
Yeah, so there's that one paragraph which reads, in truth, Rucha alienated everyone she'd ever known while climbing to the top. She died the way she lived, selfishly and unashamed. After one too many Jaeger bombs, she'd fallen off her yacht. Her behaviour meant she couldn't get reincarnated and was locked out of top-tier afterlives. Her last roadblock to paradise was this sad puppy. So that paragraph is doing a lot of work in this story, right? It's laying out everything you need to know about the character of Rucha. It's laying out who she is, what happened to her, why is she there, what does she want to get out of it, what's her quest, what is she seeking. And it comes fairly late in the story, right? It comes towards the end, number one. And number two, it is very much telling. It is exposition. That's critical information, but it would be great, A, if we could get it earlier, and B, if we could get it woven into the story, into the dialogue or into the subtext so that we actually, feel it.
I think as well, like when we're talking about point of view, and I appreciate here there's some head hopping going on, but something to really think about when we're thinking about point of view is, all right, if we're setting Rucha up as the point of view character, well then everything needs to be filtered through that lens of her, right? And until we get to this Cerberus head hop at the end, everything else needs to be filtered through her. And so these kinds of lines like, in truth, Rucha alienated everyone she'd ever known while climbing to the top. Is that how she sees it? I don't think so. Maybe once something happens to trigger her to make a huge realization in her life, maybe that's how she sees it, but certainly not initially. Like that's not how she sees herself at all. So if you're going to tell the story from Rucha's perspective, you can't just tell us that up front. That has to be woven into the subtext of what she says versus what we see her do. And we need to, as readers, sort of compare, okay, what's she saying versus what happened. Now we make the judgment, in truth, she's vain. In truth, she treated people like garbage.
Yeah.
I don't think she can make that assessment and just tell us that.
Yeah, and that paragraph does come off as that is the realization that she's come to in that moment, that is her perspective, that in truth, that she understands that. But you need to lead into that, like you said, with the dominoes falling, that there needs to be a really compelling reason why she's overturned a lifetime of living selfishly and unashamedly, that in that moment she's actually acknowledged it.
And I would say that the puzzle piece that's potentially there that you could use to do that is this link to her childhood dog, right? So some people are just dog people, right? They're not people. And it seems to me like Rucha might just be a dog person, right? And maybe that's a fun idea to explore where in life the only one who understood her was her childhood dog.
Yeah.
And we could go into what maybe a little bit of that backstory might be. Why did she struggle with people? Why has she always struggled? Why was that dog the one who understood her and who she could understand back and who she empathized with and so on? And how does that now play out in her interaction with Cerberus? That's potentially like a way that you could make those dominoes hit each other. But it has to be a little bit more on the page. Like, what is it about her specifically and her nature as a dog person that makes this interaction with Cerberus work in her favor? And how does that link maybe to a bit of her backstory? And it would solve that problem too. If you said in the beginning, she's been set up as this vain person, kind of shallow, like how can we relate to her? Well, we might be able to relate to her if we understand actually her childhood was pretty tough. Her parents were tough on her and the only one who understood was this dog. And we would start to feel that empathy for her and root for her a little bit. And then when there's this conclusion where she uses her talents as like a dog whisperer basically to get her way with Cerberus, like we'd be like, oh, that would feel more like a payoff.
Yeah.
That's just one way of approaching it. Like there's other ways, but I feel like those puzzle pieces were in the story and just not really sewn together in that obvious way that would make it feel more satisfying.
Yeah, I think that's a really compelling idea. And yeah, that aspect of her personality really needs to be set up earlier, as in when she's confronted with this three-headed dog and her emotional reaction is not fear at being confronted with this 6-foot three-headed dog. It is actually, oh, this reminds me of my dog.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that would be interesting too, right? Because if you set up this kind of potentially scary environment where there's this giant dog looming over her and her reaction is, oh, nice puppy. Like that's interesting in itself, and that sets us up for that conclusion then of how that all wraps up. You know, Nina's described herself as a pantser, and I think that's evident here because what you do when you write as a pantser is that these ideas are coming to you and you're bringing them into the story as they come to you. And what happens next is you need to now go back and look at the bigger picture and sew those pieces together and maybe take pieces that have come later and weave them into the beginning of your story. Choose the pieces of information, especially in a piece of flash, choose the pieces that are most relevant to the story and weave them all the way through. And then maybe take out the pieces that are less relevant. Like here's an example. We've mentioned her fashion a couple of times, and while that serves to establish her character a little bit, I think mentions of a specific Prada dress and so on aren't necessarily feeding the narrative in the same way that maybe these mentions of the dog might, if that's the way you chose to take it.
I'd like to maybe move forward to the ending, right, which I thought was quite a interesting way to end it. She gets flung into a waiting womb to be reincarnated. Presumably she thought she was going to get into Elysium, but her motives and what she actually desires in this moment are a little bit muddied for me because we had the explanation of she couldn't get reincarnated and was locked out of top-tier afterlives. Did she want to get reincarnated or did she want to move on to Elysium? What did she actually want? I think what would have been a compelling ending is if you'd set up within her that sense of regret, like I should have acted differently in my life, and that realization that I should have acted differently. And even if she doesn't know it, even if she doesn't know that she wants to be reincarnated, but Cerberus picks up on that and actually reincarnates her, I think that's kind of what happened, but it's about that realization. It's about feeling that regret and actually, oh, hang on, maybe I did live my life in a way that I now regret, to make that ending more poignant.
Yeah, I agree. I think those motivations need to be clear up front of what she wants to get out of this to make that payoff feel satisfying. Like it's sort of set up that she wants these top tier afterlives. Well, if we look at it from her perspective, what does that look like? She's going to be reincarnated as someone rich and powerful, right? Is that really the outcome we want? When she's going to get reincarnated now, she has been given that second chance to go and be reincarnated. Is that to be rich and famous? Probably not.
Has she learned her lesson?
Has she learned her lesson? Well, no, but that's not really spelled out here. Like which womb? You know, what life? I think it's important for us to know if she's being reincarnated, to what? To help us understand, is she going to learn her lesson? Will this be like a good, happy story? What are we to take from this apart from like she managed to argue her way through?
Yeah, I feel like she has to want that second chance, and I'm not clear that she does. I think she's just trying to manipulate the situation.
Yeah, she doesn't necessarily have to want it at the start, right? Like, yeah, she's trying to manipulate it, get it. And this is the thing. Maybe in the beginning, she's trying to get a quality afterlife, right? She wants a reincarnation to be rich and powerful. That's the kind of character we set up at the start. Maybe that's how she's coming to Cerberus. I'm going to convince him to like let me into a good, fancy afterlife. But then by the end, if she comes to this realization, like, actually, I want to redo the life I had because I made some mistakes. I don't want to be rich and famous. Actually, what I really want is to just be loved or to show love or whatever it is that we want to learn as our lesson. I think that needs to be clearly paid off there in the outcome.
So one more thing I want to say that's kind of aside from the characters here is the setting. And I think this setting in Hades with the three-headed dog and the afterlife, that's an interesting location and an interesting setting. And I think that there was a lot more opportunity there to really evoke that setting and really show us what that looks like. Because when I was picturing this scene in my mind, I could picture the three-headed dog, I could picture the person standing in front of the three-headed dog, but there wasn't much kind of going on around them apart from maybe just a river.
Yep.
Maybe that's, what you wanted from the setting, but I think that there was an opportunity there to, using all of the senses, really evoke what that whole thing looked like and what that whole thing felt like and build that world a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we get quite a few stories like this where it's a conversation, actually, and they might set up where the conversation is taking place, but that setting is never used. It's more just that's where this conversation is taking place. And there is always potential to use the setting to break up the conversation a little bit with action within the scene, using select details that you choose to describe about that setting. What subtext do they hold? Like, what does that detail that you're drawing our attention to mean in the context of this story? But also just using sensory details to evoke that emotion and evoke that response you're trying to get out of the reader. Now, personally, I felt that this extract where Cerberus has this kind of episode, there was a lot of words dedicated to that. And it didn't, to me, deliver like in a powerful way, in a way that justified the word count that was devoted to it. And I wasn't quite sure, again, with those dominoes, like what's happening here. She seems to have set Cerberus off and then that sets her off. I think those words might have been better used with some action or some interaction between these characters that creates that flow-on effect. And that action could be happening within the scene as opposed to just dialogue.
All right, so let's talk about the prompts a little bit as well. So the first prompt is the word prompt, the word palms, and it appears in the sentence, Rucha moved forward, palms open to show she was harmless. So I think, having your palms, the palms of hands we spoke about on the long list episode, that was a very common response. But I will say one thing about this sentence that stood out to me was, I guess, the second half, to show she was harmless. And it is reflective of, I guess, something that appears all throughout this story, which is the telling rather than showing. So I would much rather that she just walked with her palms out open rather than the secondary explanation to show that she was harmless.
Yeah, and I think, again, if we want to go into subtext, like you could layer on top of that again, where if you were choosing to use this story idea of her affinity with dogs, we know there are some gestures you can do with dogs to make them feel safe. We know there's these kinds of ways that you can behave around dogs. If she were doing that and just doing that in a way, like, don't tell us to make sure she looks like she's harmless, but showing that she actually has this close kind of connection with this dog where they understand each other, I think would be a powerful way to use that gesture.
And so the action prompt of telling a lie appears, I guess, consistently throughout this story. It's one of the recurring elements of the interaction, that she is consistently lying to Cerberus and also to herself.
I think that was an interesting theme to explore, and certainly that self-reflection piece and coming from where she is in the beginning to where she ends up, I think that works well. What would have also helped add value there is to just understand why she's lying a bit. Not just that she has this inflated perception of herself, but what does that mean in this context when she's trying to get her way into the afterlife?
And then finally we get to the anti-prompt, which is about head hopping. And as Nina has explained, like, this is the whole idea of Cerberus is stemming from that anti-prompt. I think using Cerberus to fulfill that head hopping anti-prompt is probably sufficient, right? If you had Cerberus and the three heads, and hopping between those three heads in conversation is probably good enough, right? We do get
You say good enough. I think that's great. That was great. That was a standout to me.
I guess what I'm saying is I don't think you need to go to that next level of having the perspective of Cerberus being in this story. I think you're much better served just by having Rucha be the focus of the story.
I agree. And I think that a lot of people did that this round. They sort of wanted to hedge their bets a little bit and say, look, I've probably got to do it for real as well. Like, I've got this really wonderful creative idea, but I better just tick that box just in case, because I don't want to get excluded. And I fully understand why you do that. But we described in the long list episode for this round, like, we don't want you to do that. We want you to have your creative take. We want you to be bold with that. It is very unlikely that we are going to say, no, that's not good enough. And I agree with you, Ed. I think that jump to Cerberus's perspective right at the end there really did detract. I think those words would have been better spent dwelling in why Rucha has come to the change by the end of the story. We're just getting to know her. We're just getting to sort of understand how her brain works, and then we've jumped out to this sort of exterior perspective. And that is why the rule's there, right? I think that keeping focus on one character helps us relate to them. It helps us deepen that connection and really feel the impact of the outcome. So I would say to Nina and to other entrants, like, be brave with your creative ideas, because we'll be on board. But yeah, I think overall, I would say everything we've discussed here, the word I would use to describe it is cohesion, right? I think we just needed a little bit more cohesion around this story, like a unifying thread that sort of weaves through a little bit more to hold that story together. I think all the pieces are there, but I think to make that conclusion feel more satisfying, if we just had this framework that was sort of all one unit instead of like separate ideas sort of being tied together. I don't know. I feel like we've just hung shit on this story, and I love Nina's writing, so I don't want to do that. I want to call out some of the good stuff as well.
Yep.
And one of the really great things I loved about this was character, right? We've got an interesting character here, and we get some of those fun details. Like when a character is kind of saying one thing and doing another, that's always interesting to a reader, I feel like. And we've got that here in spades. You know, like we can relate to Rucha. Like, we can see what's going on here. Like, it's pulled us in, you know, and now you just need to deliver on that. Okay, here's what that story meant for me.
And really all the elements of a good story are there. As I said at the outset, you've got that whole arc of Rucha's character, and starting from a position of like self-denial to this position of actual understanding and lining up what her view of herself is with Cerberus and having an ending that is beneficial and sought after for everyone involved. I think it's a very satisfying ending that you can reach. So yeah, it is just more about really showing us that character through your story.
Yeah, and how that change has taken place. Because another thing that Nina has done well here is she's chosen a good amount of scene to tell.
Yeah.
You know, this is like one scene, it's a compelling setting. We're getting backstory, but we're not getting dragged into the past. We're getting the backstory we need in the moment through dialogue and through that action, which is fantastic. And something we say often when we're doing critiques is that someone's bitten off more than they could chew for 500 words. I really think Nina had the right amount here. And there's some really interesting details in there, like the childhood dog, like the fact that she had too many Jaeger bombs and fell off her yacht.
Yep.
Like, that's really intense, right? Very interesting kind of detail. So that stuff keeps you invested and keeps you reading. And I think that's really great. And like, we haven't even really said it, but, you know, we've talked about the head hopping approach, and we've got Cerberus, a 3-headed dog. Like, she literally hops on the dog's head.
That's
It's
true.
like,
That's true.
just-
Yeah.
I really like that. And I sort of forgot about that as we're talking about the story, but that was something I noticed when I first read it, of like how hilarious that was to me. And I think that's really good.
So thanks, Nina, for your story. It was very brave of you, and so you had nothing to worry about.
Yeah, we're on your side.
Yeah, absolutely. And we hope that some of our tips help you out in the next round of the comp.
And I also have to just do a little shout out and thank you to Nina, because she helped me with one of my stories recently. So we were both supposed to enter the New York City Midnight 250 competition. Somebody DNF'd.
No, I DNF'd.
But I did enter, and Nina was a beta reader on my story, and she provided some really great insight for me. So I'm really grateful to you, Nina, for giving me that insight, because the things that you said about my story were also very helpful. There were bits missing in my story, and so I guess we're all in this together, and I hope that I've been able to return the favour today.
Well, thank you. And we'll be back very shortly with our second Daredevil in a week's time. So until then, ride on.
Right on.
We hope you enjoyed this special Daredevil episode of Not Quite Right. If you have thoughts on this story, follow us on social media and join the conversation. And if you'd like to participate in the next round of the competition, head over to our website at notquiteright.com. That's WRITE.
Something doesn't seem quite right.